Hi, good morning, everyone. David Cross with you again today. I thought I'd get back to the basics again and start going through some of the subnet, or what we call block import facilities, and the capabilities of that API, in that we can call a specific import function and have IP control, which again is the IPM source we're using, provide us back the next available subnet based on a container location and also based on a block type, which combined together help us give the next available subnet, and it'll provision that information. So very similar to like what we did in our very first video, where we talked about the IP assignment process and how you can acquire the next available, we can do the same thing with the block capabilities, and that's what I'm going to show today. Now, once we've determined how to do this, and you start working with importing subnets and having IP control give you back the next available, and you're comfortable with that process, there's a few other things that we can start to build on, which would enable us to be more dynamic in how we determine the subnet by looking it up through a container policy or doing some other interaction with APIs to really help build this workflow so that there's minimal input required other than the login or other details. So what we're going to do is we're going to work within this Atlanta Virtual Office 0928 facility, mine, and we're going to build out some subnets in here, and we're going to use the block type data because I know that this works. And a couple of things that we're going to notice when we do this is that the API builds the next available. So if we were to look at the available space, we're going to see 10.0.1 and then a jump to 4. And then from 4, that's going to take us all the way to the end of 7, 255, so up to the 8 network. So what we should start to see, if we have fragmented address space, is IP control will start to fill in those gaps, which is part of the product and really some of the design goals behind it to help defragmentize your network if possible. So we're going to do this, and you're going to see it fill it in as we move along. Now I'm going to jump back over to my Swagger because, again, we're going to use this as our tool to help us look at the information, do a get, and then do a import to make sure things work. And then we're just going to copy and paste that into an example script. Again, very simple to do, and it pretty much provides everything we need to make that work. If you've been following any of the previous examples, you may already have some scripts and may want to work with those and duplicate them and so forth, but I'll bring that up shortly. So the first thing is under the block category of the Swagger, if you're browsing the API namespace, you should notice a get block by IP address method, and that allows us to put in the IP address of the block that we're looking for, and then we're able to run this example and have it return to us the JSON child block structure, which, like the IP address, the first example we provided, we would then go back in and use that to help us pull out the values that we need for the process. Sorry, I typed that address in there wrong, had a little delay in my screen. So really what we have in return here is we have our response, and we're going to go ahead and copy this so that we can take a look at the data that we're going to try to import. Now, under the block imports, we should, or under the block category, let's look for imports, and for some reason my screen is running very slow this morning. Actually, it's under child block, so we'll go to child block namespace, and we're going to look for the imports, import child block. Now, one thing to note, and I'm just show you here, by clicking on the schema or the parameter list on the right-hand side, Swagger will fill in this import parameter with all of those available options and with their type strings or type class for the fields. Now, we don't want to use this because we already went and got a get, but if you wanted to, you could use that as the schema to provide that functionality. And again, we need to build a wrapper, very similar to importing an IP device, that allows us to import this child block and to specify its opening syntax. So we have that, and we need to trail this off with a closing bracket. All right, so let's go back up and look at our fields, and let's see what we really need to have in this list because we really do not need all of this information. The first thing is let's get rid of the overlapping address space in this particular case. We're not building a subnet or a root block, so we're not going to define this. So it's really not applicable here. but if you're getting this information, it would be in terms of the get type data. Now, the key to having IP control give you the next available subnet is to not provide a subnet. If I wanted to import a specific subnet, I could provide its subnet address, and then I could provide the block size. I'm not going to do that here, and I'm also going to remove the block name. And the reason I'm going to is that the block name by default is derived from the subnet address / CIDR size or block size. So I don't know what that is if I'm getting the next, and I'm going to let the system auto-generate that name. The 3 fields here that we do need to have, one is the block size. You can change that accordingly. Deployed represents a subnet within the IPControl API space. So we're going to use deployed, and we're going to create a subnet. And the block type data is going to tell IPControl to look for a data block, and that specifically we want the next available block of that type that matches that criteria. And then for the container, we do need to have the container address, but there's one thing we need to do in a modification, in that we're only looking for a string, and the value returned to us by the interface in the gets was in an array. So we need to change that, and we need to remove the open square brackets so it's no longer an array, it's a string now. And we can also, as an example, take this as a short name if there's no overlap. So if there's no duplicate container names and things, you can also use the short name for this. And then lastly, let's get rid of all of these kind of extraneous detail fields. We can do description. And we'll do API auto-generated subnet. And these next few fields we'll leave there. We'll leave execute from discovery true because we want that enabled. And we should be able to go through the rest of these. Now there's some policies in here which we're not going to include. And the reason we're not going to include them is I don't really know that they're applicable in this case, and we really may want to come back and change this afterwards unless we have a template set up, in which case you may have that already done. So let's look at our structure, make sure we get rid of the trailing commas, shouldn't have anything in the last field. And I think, quite literally, this is all we need to have in order to test this. And once we enable it and test it, we should know that everything works okay. All right, very good. So what we should see, and like the IP address assignment, IPControl just simply gives you the next available IP address, whether it's an IP for a device or whether it's a subnet IP. And in this case, we have a subnet IP. So there's not much detail there, but like we have in the other cases, we could go in and grab the subnet address. We could go back up to the block fields, and we could do a get block by IP address, changing the subnet address, and then pull out those details in order to see the JSON and to work with more of that structure. Now, as I had mentioned previously, there's some things we couldn't do, like the block adder and the block name. Those are auto-generated, so if we were to try to derive that, that would be almost impossible unless we knew the subnets. But there may also be other things that we want to do or that are available to us, such as user-defined fields and things along that line. And I'm not going to touch on that at this video. I think we can get into that in another video. And as we get into some of the lookup capabilities and how we might want to use a lookup to determine the container, which we need to have for this process. Okay, so great, we know all of that works. So we know now that in our block structure or child block, that in the import capability, that those fields are effectively what we need to build the API so that we can import that facility in that particular container. So let's go ahead and jump over to our scripts here. And I have already created a script. Of course, I like to make sure these things work before instructing others. And in building this, I've pretty much duplicated what I had in the other scripts. So let's walk through this kind of quickly, show you where we've inserted the new data and how we're going to kind of extract this out. So number one, if we're using IPControl 9 or 10, we still need to have this token process, so go ahead and make sure that you have a way to obtain the token. Or you can look back at our first video that talks about this, or the second, which talks about how to get this information out, and you can build your kind of own token script as we have. Now, in the input parameter, the required information is going to be container at a minimum. I'm going to assume the block type. However, in a real world scenario, and we're going to get some of these again at a later time, you're going to want to specify potentially different types of blocks or subnet types like data, voice over IP, and others. Or you're going to try to do this in some automatic or programmatic way, and this will be determined through that application. So I'm going to do this and specify container, but I would also in the future specify a block type or any other value that might change, even down to the status where it could be reserved or some other type. So we're going to pass that in as a variable 2. And then I'm going to construct a variable that's going to call a curl command. And we're going to tell it again to -k skip our insecure certificates. And then we want to do this silently, being the -s. And lastly, we're doing a post. So that's a -x. Don't forget your headers. You need to make sure this is application JSON. And also to build your token into the authorization bearer, which is required for the IPControl login for, again, 9 and 10. And for IPControl 8, you can do this through basic authentication or authorization. In the input that we're going to use for the data is effectively that information that I had from that field that I copied from the Swagger interface. So other than this container being the short container, we just basically have copied over everything else and pasted it into the block structure here, or the data structure. Make sure that you have your only one opening bracket. I found as I was pasting this, it might have been an extra in there. Make sure there's only one. And then you need to have this input child block structure wrapped around this. So go ahead and paste what you have in there. And when you get down to the container function, what we need to do, since we're going to pass this in as a variable, is we need to close the open structure. So if you look up here in this -d data structure, there's a single quote that opens up this input child block structure. And to kind of put this in there, we need to close it. So go ahead and put a single quote, put in your variable, and open that structure again so that it can be later terminated down further in the termination single quote here. And in the rest of this, I think should be fine. Again, you can do all this by variables. So if you want to replace these with variables like size, the status, feel free to do so. And we're probably going to do that in a future video. Now, your endpoint, again, should point to the endpoint that was presented to you when you ran this import. Again, these are auto-generated to show you what that endpoint is from a calling method. And also keep in mind that you have your curl. So we could have literally copied this and modified the entire curl structure to do our authorization bearer. However, I had done this previously. So go ahead and copy or do whatever is necessary to make this easy for you in that setup. And lastly, again, I'm using that JQ command, and I'm piping this result. When it goes out and gets this address, it's going to generate a result, either an error or a result for us. And I'm going to pipe this into JQ space, and then I want from the root to pull out the result variable, the result JSON, and then I'm going to remove the open quotes and double quotes around that string. Now, this is going to be a little different here, so I'm going to echo out the result just so we have the information. But then I want to go ahead and I actually want to run the get block, and I want to pass this new IP address from the subnet into the next get command so that I can immediately pull the result and process that further. So what I'm going to need to do, and what the call requires, is that it's just the subnet address. So it's just IP address in the subnet, and then you can have the status, which in this case will be deployed. But I had to strip out the CIDR and the size. So there is a sed command or sed grep that will allow you to do that kind of simply to remove the slash CIDR notation. And then I'm getting the block. So that's really it. Get the block and then echo it. And then we want to assign that as the next available in that container. Right. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you what that looks like. And I'm going to pull up here my other user I was running. And we'll use tac login. And then I want to specify my container. Okay, and that was pretty quick. And what we should see then is, again, our statement that, hey, we assign the next available for you in this subnet. So if we were just passing this back, that would be all we would need. But the next command in there where we went out and got the block details, again, if you were trying to pull something back or even modify attributes, you would want to go ahead and get that parameter but then you may want to pass it back into an import again to modify the structure or do something else with it. So that's it. And then what you're going to see in IPControl is we'll see then that the subnet was filled in. We had 2 previously. 3 is filled in as well. And then the next available, if we were to click it, would be probably up around 8 or 9. And it looks like it was 8 in that case. And refresh this, you'll see 8 listed as well. All right, so that was not too quick, but I think quick enough to get the point across. And hopefully this will help. And I'm going to build on top of this principle again, like we did with the IP addresses. Maybe provide some examples of looking up through VLAN ID or by some other type of API that will hopefully make this easier to make the determination of subnet and container. So hope this helped, and leave comments for me if you have any questions, suggestions, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.